From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
If you work on an Android app, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to presume you do, you'll know that when your user reports a problem or a crash, it's the absolute worst feeling. To make matters worse, they might one-star your app, go on Twitter and complain about the app, and if they're feeling particularly merciless, probably go on Reddit or something and post it there. But you know what? They have absolutely every reason to. If you treat your customers basically as an offsite QA team, it's rude to them and it's just bad for business. As developers, we don't want to rely on customers to report errors. Instead, we want to catch this much early on. Ideally, you just have automated tests and these tell you when there's a problem. But as we've talked about on the show multiple times, that's not always as easy as we want it to be. Because writing tests can be hard. That's why Sentry, our sponsor for today's show, tells you about errors in your code before your customers have a chance to encounter them. Not only do they tell you about the errors, they also give you helpful details that help you fix these errors. For example, how many users were impacted by this bug, the complete stack trace if it's a crash, the commit ID when this error was released, the engineer who wrote this line of code that was busted, that and a whole lot more. If your code is broken, let's fix it together. That's Sentry's tagline. I love it. You can check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Sentry is a pretty common word. It's actually a pretty cool name for the service if you know the English meaning of the word. But I want to make sure you get that domain name right. It's sentry.io. Once again, sentry.io/for, as in FOR/Android. Check them out today and fix your errors before your users encounter them. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Sentry.
Kaushik, you're back again. It's good to have you back.
Thank you so much. It is good to be back. I had a question for you, Don.
Yeah, what's up?
Have you ever used the material components that Google gives us?
I have used them a little bit, and I'm glad you asked because one of my favorite things that has been released from Google over the last number of years actually has nothing to do with coding whatsoever, and it's actually the material design stuff. And the reason why I say this is because as a developer, a lot of times I want to build something and I want to just make it look good, and I don't have to worry about finding a designer and designing something from the ground up and then having to build all these custom views. I want to just use some type of design language that's already out there just so I can kind of get my app done. And that's what I feel that the material design stuff has done. And then now recently, the material components have come out, which have made it a lot easier to implement directly inside of your Android app. Have you used them at all?
So the interesting thing is I've had a very similar experience. When material design came out, it was very interesting, and I built some of these components custom. The thing is, I've actually not followed along as closely with the material components. I have remembered, I've seen over past like Google I/O announcements, a lot of the good stuff coming out, but I've not actually used them, and I feel like I'm shooting myself in the foot here because I'm like doing more work than necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely understand that.
Yeah, which is why in today's show, Don figured hey, we got to get Kaushik to stop doing all this unnecessary work. So we have two of our friends from Google who are here to help us with that problem. Welcome to the show, Connie and Cameron.
Hi.
Hi.
Connie and Cameron, if you guys wouldn't mind taking a few moments to explain who you are, what your role is at Google, and kind of how it's related to the material components for the listeners, it would be very helpful.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can go first. I'm Cameron Ketcham. I am the tech lead for the Material Android team at Google. And so I basically work on managing the technical work that we're doing to build out the components and build out the subsystems and theming related to material design components.
Very cool.
My name is Connie Shi. I work with Cameron on the material design components, specifically the Android library. I've been focusing on chip and recently on batching.
Oh, very nice.
Thank you for the introduction.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the good work. So you said something that I thought was very interesting, Connie. You said specifically for Android. Does that mean like the material components like exist also for like other platforms?
Yes, that's correct. There are support for web, iOS, Android, and Flutter.
Oh.
And they're all available on our various GitHub repos.
Awesome. And maybe like, yeah, I jumped in there, but maybe what we should do is like dial back a little, because this is actually genuinely one thing that has confused me in the past. So we do have material design, where like the Material IO website exists, and we have a lot of good stuff there. What exactly is the material components? Like, how is that different from any of the other components we use? Can you like give us like, if someone came up to you who is an Android developer and said, hey, material components, what's that about? How would you answer that question?
I guess I would say that the like material.io site, like the design site, is guidance that any engineer could potentially use to build an application. And what we do is we work directly with the designers that have implemented that guidance to create components that work and fit within that guidance. So I guess one of the other questions you had was around like, what's the difference between like just the normal components that you might use versus like material design components, right? So like we're built on top of the native Android widgets, and the idea behind the components that we're building is, well, one, they match material.io, like the guidance, but we're also kind of pushing the frontier in terms of how you might build an app and the usability of that. Whereas the native Android widgets are much more general and just there to provide developers to build an app, that any kind of app that they need. Ours is more along the lines of like, oh, here's the research and design guidance that we use at Google. And these are kind of the best practices for you when you're building an app. So we're trying to create the code to back that, so it's a lot easier to use.
So from a developer standpoint, what I'm hearing is that if there's maybe something like a bottom sheet or a navigation thing that I see on material.io, your team is actually building the Android implementation of that I can use inside of my Android project and just kind of slap some code into my XML layout, and then all of a sudden I have that nice fluid interaction that that your team has maybe created. Is that assumption correct?
Yeah, that's basically it.
I think the other difference I'd like to point out, and also benefit from using our components, is material design, like we just mentioned, is not only specific to the Android platform. So the components that we provide, because they're cross-platform, a developer or a product team could use the same design principles and have components from each platform. I have building blocks that are provided from our teams for each platform so that they can have a unified experience regardless of which platform their end user happens to be on.
So does that mean that you actually built, I know you're on the Android team. Do you have an internal like iOS team that does something similar for iOS, and a team inside of like the web and Flutter that kind of build components for each of those different, platforms?
We do.
Yeah, we work closely with them to make sure that we have alignment and that we all, conform to the material spec principles.
So that's a good question. Is there ever a point in time when maybe there's some components that have been completed in one platform but maybe aren't in another platform? Or how I guess another question is, if that is the case, do you have any type of timeline that you try to stick within, so you're on the same timeline as the other teams, so that, as a developer, I know that I can implement this on Android, but hey, my iOS team, maybe that component's not done, but it should be done within the next couple of weeks? Or is there any of that guidance out there?
So that's an interesting question. The thing is, yeah, it's not exactly perfect. Part of the history of the way material design is built, as you kind of mentioned before, is that it started out with the guidance, really, and then we started to build out teams for each platform to implement things that followed the guidance. And the thing is, like, from when the guidance was created to now, like, the teams have kind of been, I mean, we're definitely closely talking and we're like, working together, but a lot of different things have happened on each of the platforms. So there are definitely differences. At this point, I'd say, like, for most of the major components that you would need, like text fields or other really like core to your app components, those will all exist and be basically the same. There are some cases where there's components that don't exist on other platforms, and we're trying to do our best to like reduce that as much as possible. But there's some cases like Flutter is relatively new, so they're definitely doing a lot of work to try to kind of catch up and implement more components that we already have on iOS, Android, and web.
The other thing I'd like to say is reaching parity, while it's important for these core components, like Cameron mentioned, is not always necessarily the number one priority. There could be instances where certain components are more relevant for, let's say, the web or iOS because they are particular to those platforms, and it wouldn't make sense for other platforms to adopt them. Mm-hmm. So I think our product managers definitely make a case-by-case call on in those situations.
Yeah, definitely. And also in the same vein, like, there's certain differences on each platform, like between iOS and Android, and we try and follow like the platform guidance in certain cases. So in those cases, like date range, time picker kind of dialogues, like those are quite different, and we kind of consider those mostly to be like more native. Material design and Android go really close hand in hand. So the date picker dialogue, it's actually something we're working on right now. And so, like, in my opinion, on Android, you get like the full material experience just because Android has really embraced material design, obviously, because they're both made by Google. But on iOS, there are a few differences. And I think it's fine because iOS users expect certain things to behave in the way that they expect across the system. So yeah, we try to keep that in mind.
I feel that Flutter also I built a few Flutter apps, and I feel that was one of the huge benefits to me when I was writing a Flutter app is I could just rely on material design, all the components that were built already, because then I could just build the app out, and then I had it on two platforms, which was really nice. So a lot of the core components that I needed were already there, which was fantastic.
Yep.
And
glad to hear it.
And so if I'm hearing this right, is it fair to say that if you're using, well, let me rephrase that. So if I have a material component for the date picker, is the idea then that it typically would look the same across all platforms, or do you think it's justifiable for like the material component to look a little differently between platforms?
Yeah, so for the date picker, for instance, like I forget exactly for iOS like how that's different, but like there are definitely certain core differences like
Got it. Mm-hmm.
in those specific things, and like the designers that are implementing the material design guidance have kind of decided like, oh, those are more core to how the operating system works as opposed to like what's in your app. It's more like you're calling into the operating system to get some more core, like
right,
yeah, like a date. Like every app is gonna get a date, and you kind of want that experience to be the same across all apps, as opposed to having a weird kind of mix match in between. Like, oh, this app does it this way, this other app does it a different way.
That makes sense. I think that makes perfect sense. So one thing that I usually typically do is, because like it's also a really nice domain name, material.io is usually like, if I ever have anything related to material design or some component that I'm looking at, I head to the material.io website, and that's like literally the link, right? Can you folks help break it down? I see typically 3 tabs. There's design, develop, and tools. The tools part usually makes sense to me, but between the design and develop, can you like help explain what that is? Is design like mostly the guidance, and develop like the actual like components that you find, or like how would one try to parse or understand like the material.io website? Like, how do we like get that experience from the website?
Yeah. So yeah, basically what you said. There's the design section, which is the main design guidance, and that's where like any guidance will be. New guidance that we haven't created components for is all there. And then in the develop section, you'll see for each platform, like the docs related to that specific platform. And those are actually the docs that we write ourselves. Like Android team writes the Android docs, iOS team writes the iOS docs. And those are also all in our GitHub repos. So it's the same documentation in both places.
Very cool. Very cool. And if you were to, and so design is like the guidance, develop is where like we have the actual like views and widgets, or like the stuff, the libraries that we can pull from. Can you also maybe tell the folks what the tools section is and like some of the tools that we have there?
So we actually don't really work too much on the tools, but there are a few things in there that are useful. Like, for instance, Gallery is a tool that is sort of like Sketch in that it'll help let a designer upload like mocks and gives a developer something to look at. There's also like the color tool, which helps you pick colors. And a new tool that we released recently, or are about to release.
I think it was actually released last year, the Material Theme Editor.
Yeah.
It's a plugin, I think, to Sketch and perhaps other platforms to, I think, make it easy for designers or developers who have a design flair to customize their own like theme, their own, which is based on the baseline that we provide
in Sketch, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it's definitely available in Sketch. I'm not sure if it's available for other alternatives to Sketch. But the gallery, my understanding is that it's a collaboration tool for designers and developers, so that we don't have to necessarily understand the in and outs of a Sketch file, because it's shareable and collaborative in this very engineering friendly format that's on the web, and it's freely provided by Google. And if your designer syncs their Sketch files, you could see mocks and you could click on them and not download, but I think you could look at the dimensions and switch devices to see exactly what the DP value is for Android and maybe pixel value is for iOS.
One of my favorite things I've seen on the tools part of Material.io is actually the icons, where I can go look up any of the icons I may want to use, because when I'm building an app, of course, I'm going to need an icon here or there. And then there's also options for if I want it filled or outlined or rounded or two-tone or anything like that. And I can just download these either as, a particular icon. Looks like there's icon fonts for web projects, and then you can download the SVG files, PNGs, and everything. So it's super, super useful to have that out there.
Yeah.
There's a ton of stuff that looks like is out there for material components. And I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about what exactly falls under the material components. Are there specific views or widgets that you support? Is there like themes or topography or anything like that? I wonder if you can kind of give us an overview of what falls under material components for the folks that are listening that may want to use them.
Yeah, so it is, like I said, a lot of components and theming, basically. So what we try to build out is for each of the components that is in the design guidance section of material.io, we try to have a corresponding component on Android that you can use that implements that guidance. And we also have theming, which is a big part of what material design is now, in terms of making it really super simple for you to take the components that exist and make them branded, make them look like what your app should look like, rather than like every other material design app, which is what it was like in the beginning. So there's like color, shape, and typography theming for now, which like lets you change a lot of the way that your app will look. And then, we have a bunch of different components, like I mentioned before, text field, chips, tab layout, cards, bottom nav, bottom map bar. There's a lot of different ones, and you can find all of those on our develop tab. There's a component section which kind of lists like all of the components that are part of our library.
It looks like what the URL would be material.io/develop/Android. We'll make sure that we add that to the show notes. For folks that are, like I said, that are listening to this and say, hey, this sounds interesting, I want to use some of these cool material components that I see on material.io. If I wanted to actually start using them today, could you walk me through what I need to do as a developer to start being able to use some of the work that you and your team have created?
Yeah, so we have our app released on Maven. So you just add Google's Maven repository, and then add our library to the dependency section. And our library package is com.google.android.material, and the artifact is material. And right now we're on a our stable release is 1.0, which was from last year at I/O, but we've done a ton more work in alpha releases. So there's a 1.1.0 alpha 05, I think. And so that is the latest one as of now, which has like a ton more updates compared to material, the 1.0 version. The 1.0 version is actually basically the same as the old 28 version of the support design library. And we switched over to 1.0 as part of the app compat to Android X refactor that happened. So
interesting. And if you have to like ballpark estimate, out of all the design guidance that are specified, let me rephrase that. Out of all the components that the design guidance specify, how many of those do you think have been implemented, like for the Android folks?
I don't know. What do you think? I mean, there's a lot of them. Either we created or are like easily creatable. Like there's some like image lists. You probably just use a recycler view.
Interesting. Yeah.
But most of them we do have in some capacity. Yeah, banner is one that we don't have. Backdrop is one that we have just given like guidance on how to create as well. Some of them, I mean, a lot of them I would like our team to make, but it's all about picking and choosing like what's the most impactful components for people. And so we've kind of left some of the easier ones for people to do on their own for now.
Got it. That makes sense.
I'd like to dive in real quick a little bit more into like the implementation, and the reason why I'm kind of diving in deeper here is because that's what a lot of people are going to be they're thinking right now when they're listening to this driving down the road or at the office, etc. And what I'm thinking here is what kind of gives me the most bang for the buck as a developer. And I asked initially how do I implement it, but that's kind of what I'm really getting at there. And I'm going to use a reference from like web development when, with HTML, we have just a very raw page. I can put some text on the screen. It's very empty. And that's kind of like how Android was, many years ago, where you just put hello world and it was just a black screen with hello world on the screen. But then we came out with like many different UI frameworks, and I'll use the most popular one, which is probably Bootstrap still. And Bootstrap came out, and I could just add these couple of CSS files and a couple of classes, and then boom, all of a sudden my page just looked 1,000 times better, and it wasn't groundbreaking. Like the design wasn't like, oh wow, this is amazing, something new, but it just made it feel better. And what happened was a lot of developers just said, hey, you know what? I'm just going to use this because it just works and it makes my life easier. That's what I'm looking for here for Android. And would you say that Material Components provides that? And if so, where can I get the biggest bang for my buck? Is it simply inheriting from a particular theme and then using these 4 or 5 controls or whatever is going to give you that kind of like instant wow factor? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is pretty much exactly that in a way. It's like what we're trying to do is make it way easy for developers who maybe don't have so much design experience or don't have a dedicated designer to be able to create something that looks good. And yeah, so like I think the major benefit of using our library is that we've thought about a lot of the design implications of these components, and so instantly your app will look better and be more usable. And in the same vein, the way that we've kind of structured the theming of the app, the idea is to make it really dead simple to make any kind of change that you need. So say like you're like, oh, I really want to change the background of everything in my app. I want a different color. I don't like what it is now. You can go in and just change like the color in a few places and have that propagate throughout the whole app. So kind of the way that we've structured the theming and structured our components to use theming is maybe you could consider a best practice for how to style your app in a way that will make it a lot easier to maintain and change in the future if you need to.
So it looks like I'm just looking at the documentation here on, this is again on material.io/develop/Android under the getting started section. And it looks like you just have to add the Gradle dependency. Then at that point, make sure you're using appcompat activity, etc. And then you can just go ahead and inherit from a material component theme, such as theme.materialcomponents or theme.materialcomponents.light, etc., or dark action bar. And then it seems from that point forward, you kind of can start using all the various different components and get those benefits you were just talking about. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. All you have to do basically is inherit from the theme, and then you can start using our components, and they're all going to be themed to the material baseline. And if you wanted to change a color, for instance, in your theme, all you have to do is override that one color attribute or whatever set of them, and then that will propagate throughout your entire app and theme all of the components that you're using by just changing that one place in your theme. So like for instance, a lot of the times we see people who are writing apps that like hard code colors into the XML layout file, or like hard code other things, or even styles can get hard coded in, and that's arguably okay. But by using the theme level and using theme attributes in our components, we make it a lot easier to make like really fine-grained changes or smaller changes that can propagate throughout your entire app.
One of the things I think has always been very visually, it's kind of like a cue for me visually when I see something on a website, on an app, etc., that's like, oh, this is material, is the concept of a card. And so let's say that I'm using the theme, the material components theme as the parent theme. I would still need to use, there's something known as a material card view in your components. I would still need to use the material card view to get all of those, nice added benefits, because if I were to use the regular card view, I wouldn't get them, correct? So I'd still need to use your components even if I'm inheriting from your theme, correct?
Yeah, so the idea is that we're trying to give you all the components that you would necessarily need to be able to include in your app. So like you said, we do have the material card view. We have like material button. We have material versions of checkboxes. And some of those are inflated for you automatically. Like if you're using a button, in the same way that the appcompat button gets inflated for a regular button in XML, we do the same thing for button. But we have all those material versions so that you can make use of the theming. And if you do make your own custom views, it's possible to read in the theme attributes in the same way that we do in our components. So you can make your custom views themable as well. So hopefully between our components and any custom views that you may need, you should be able to theme a majority of your app that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I've noticed while looking at some of the documentation is a large part of how, for example, one thing that I've always liked with input texts, the edit texts, is, you know, how you have the floating label sort of thing going on. I love that. And in fact, early on, I actually wrote like a custom view in the early days for having that done. I've noticed that in many cases for the material components, you have the same thing where you have text input, edit text, and you have to nest them in text input layouts. Is that like sort of so I guess like the thing is, as an Android developer, if I'm using a component, right? What's the easiest way for me to sort of see if like I can switch to the material component version of that? Is it just basically see if that exists and then just simply swap out the package name and like import the one that comes from com.google.android.material? Or how do you suggest like developers approach that?
We do auto-inflate for buttons and checkboxes, and radio buttons, I think. Those are the three. Card view, we have the material card view. But
let's approach it from the other side. Is there certain views that do not auto-inflate? And if so, what are the ways that I would have to implement those maybe?
So I think for someone who's interested in migrating their existing app, first thing is you could try changing your application's theme to inherit from one of the material components themes. If that is too disruptive to your UI, you could perhaps start from, like you're saying, a particular instance of a view or a component level. I'm not sure if we have documentation explaining which components we auto-inflate. It is in the open source code, but I don't think we should expect users to go and dig into the code. I think perhaps going to the Material IO site is a good starting point. You can, see which components we support, and there's always a code snippet in the documentation for what you need to use, what you need to do in order to use the material component for that particular, let's say, chip or button or text field. And like you're saying before, I think, swapping it out with what you have existing in your XML and just testing and see how it goes. And of course, please reach out and let us know if there are unexpected behavior or undesirable behavior or future requests, because we definitely want to handle your needs.
Yeah, we want to make it as easy as possible. And if there are cases where like it is really difficult to transition, then we definitely want to know that so we can make it easier.
So to recap, it sounds like you're just saying just try it out, use the theme, the parent theme, inherit from that one, and then just try these various different, components and see how they work out for you. And of course, if you run into problems, let you folks know, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think in the Get Started guide also, we know that transitioning to fully committing to use our material components theme might be a shock. So we do provide bridge themes to help you with the transition.
Can you explain what a bridge theme is for us and the folks listening?
Yeah, so a bridge theme it's basically the same as the app compat theme that you're probably already using, except for it sets all of the baseline attributes without using them. So it's kind of in between our new material theme, which uses those attributes and sets them up so that all the components use them, and the app compat theme that doesn't have any of those set. So as you start using material components, they will start to you can start theming individual things without going all the way to a full theme.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that we talked about before we hopped onto the show that you had made a mention of is something known as shadows. Now, this is the first time I've really ever heard of this. So if you could tell us kind of what they are and maybe why I would want to use them, etc.
Yeah, so one of the things that we ran into when we were implementing the components, such as the bottom map bar, which has kind of a complex shadow because there's like a cutout for the fab, is how do we get shadows to work, one, on devices where native shadow support doesn't exist, such as before Lollipop, or for different shapes, like concave shapes, native shadows aren't supported by default. So what we have created is a material shape drawable, and the material shape drawable handles drawing compatibility shadow in the cases when there is no native shadow. So that's what we're using as the background for most of our components, if not all of them now. And it doesn't do everything, but for generally like drawing like the average kind of shadow that you might need for a component, it probably can handle it. And so we lean heavily on material shape drawable to do shadows and shape theming. So each of our components, like I said, has material shape drawable as the background, and that's how you can supply like, oh, I want the top right corner to be cut or something, and it'll handle that cut. And for your own components, if you want, you can set material shape drawable as the background and get shadows for free, basically.
Oh, that's awesome, because I remember running into something very similar before. And does this material shape drawable, because it is a drawable, you can apply it as a background to any view or component. So I had a use case before where I had like 2 or 3 overlapping sort of views. It was almost like the whole paper thing that was there, and I couldn't get the shadows to just work really well. So would this be a good use case? Like say I have, let's imagine you have like, 2 views that sort of like 2 rectangular views where like you have one overlapping the other at certain points of time, but then like, the other one then like moves over. Do you think like this would be a good use case where I can apply 2 material shape drawables to each of these paper-like views? Or is it meant more for like shadows where something is like, you have like a button or like, a fab or something that's within a complete view, and then you apply the drawable to that to distinctly show those shadows?
I think it depends on the case. So I'm not exactly sure the first case, but the way that it handles drawing the shadow in cases where there is no native shadow is it draws like a gradient away from the shape. So like it actually can get a little bit tricky. Like if you have 2 components right next to each other and the shadows are like overlapping, right, they'll like both draw in the same spot. So you'd see like a bit of blending on the edge, which I don't know necessarily would look good, but right, I mean, right, it really could depend. The other tricky thing about shadows is that generally parent views will clip children to their size. So like say you have a parent view that maybe fills the whole screen and you have one view inside of it, the parent view will clip the child so it can't draw those shadows because the shadows are actually outside of the bounds. So one of the things that we do...
Interesting.
So for like bottom map bar, because generally that's the case, bottom map bar actually like gets a reference to its parent and calls set clip children false. And so that will let you draw outside of the bounds, and that's what allows you to draw that fake shadow. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you're using it. You have to make sure that the parent doesn't clip the children to the child's bounds so that it can actually draw the shadow.
I've actually seen that answer somewhere in Stack Overflow, but I think this is the first time that it's making sense to me as to why I actually do it. Because usually I'm like, oh, okay, Stack Overflow says like, change this variable clip bounds, and then just like you keep doing it until it works. But I think I finally understand now why that is.
Yep. Another thing we do, Fab is an interesting case because Fab, we converted to be a material shape drawable, but it also, actually, I can't remember now if it still does, but one of the techniques that it uses is that it increases the size of the bounds of the view so that it draws shadow still inside of the bounds, but then the Fab itself is like inset inside of it. So that's like another technique that we use in some cases. I think just for the Fab, but we're thinking about maybe adding that. At one point we thought about adding that to material shape drawable because like there's certain cases where maybe it's not possible to set the parent to not clip the children. Like, so it's kind of interesting. Like shadows are a complex problem, and like the solution to make them work on older devices is kind of complex as well.
And quick question, I know there's Fab and there's like the extended Fab, right? What exactly is the difference between the two?
So at this point, there isn't really too much of a difference. Extended Fab is newer. I would suggest using that one. Extended Fab, the reason there's two is because floating action button actually extends from image button or image. Yeah, so visibility or image button, but image button. And that meant that like we couldn't use, like it's really just a button. So we couldn't like use all of the shape theming and other theming that we've built into the material button. So what we did was we made extended floating action button, which extends material button. And it basically behaves identically to Fab, except for you also get this extended state. So if there's text, you can add text and it will be like, I don't know if you've seen like the Tasks app, the Tasks app has like a big Fab on the bottom, which like has text, which says like add tasks or something. So that's an additional thing that you can use with the extended floating action button. We don't have like full support for, like, one of the use cases now is the Fab with the bottom app bar. So the bottom app bar is a component that goes on the bottom of the screen, and the Fab actually kind of sits in it and like rests in it. Right now, because the floating action button and extended floating action button are like two totally different components, like you can't use them interchangeably, unfortunately. But I would definitely recommend like trying to use the extended floating action button because it can basically do everything floating action button can do, but a little bit better. Besides like some of the more nuanced, like intricate things that you may not necessarily need to do. And as far as I know, like the API is pretty similar. So like if you do run into a case like where you really need to switch over from one to the other, like it shouldn't be too difficult.
That makes sense. So this is like more like a futuristic question for you folks, right? Eventually, do you see like the basic components in Android just becoming the material components? And because like as I understand the material components, like you can also customize these like pretty well, right? So because initially my thought process was like, oh, the base components that you have, like image view and like and they're assuming I'm not using like the full material design spec as my design system. Maybe then I can use that to sort of build these out, was the thinking. But the more and more I hear you folks say it, it sounds like the material components in themselves can be pretty customizable and they take some of the most sensible defaults. So do you think eventually like Android is heading in the direction, or like, yeah, Android is heading in the direction where like a lot of the base components just use these? Or is it always like, do you think it's an explicit decision to always keep material components, separate and like have that identity of being the material design component?
I think it makes sense, like you're saying, because most Android apps follow the material design guidance that the framework UI toolkit would become more in alignment. However, I think there would always be, I think, an engineering component to the material design team because our focus is very much on exploration and refinement and incorporation feedback based on external and internal users developers and teams who've used our components and design principles and incorporated into their product and received, user feedback. So I think there's a differentiate between like basic core components and that maybe getting baked into the core framework UI toolkit and the sort of higher level, like whatever the next theming is, that will not necessarily be something that the core Android team works on, but rather the like mission and prerogative of a material design engineering team. So sorry, I think I didn't really answer your question. I think it's hybrid.
No, I was trying to get a sense of like the direction that like it's heading, but I think that makes sense. I don't have any other questions. This is like great. Like it's just definitely given me a much better sense of like material design, like the components specifically. Do you folks have any like parting thoughts that you want to talk about? Like maybe some things that you'd like to let our listeners know about before we sign off?
Well, I'd like to say that one, we're going to be at Google I/O. We'll be hosting office hours and also app reviews. So please stop by and say hello. And also on our GitHub repo, we do have a demo app, a catalog app that showcases all of the components that we either have implemented or sort of are currently working on. So if you like to see what's going on and you're a little timid about incorporating it into your app directly, that is one low barrier place that I would suggest you start. And you could, also tweak the demo app and see how theming works.
That sounds like a great place to go experiment to see what's going to happen. Good idea.
All right. And if folks wanted to like learn more about this, like and we'll try to make sure that we add a lot of these links that we've talked about over the course of the show into our show notes. But are there any other resources that you would like to point our listeners to? What are some of the places you think one should definitely go to get a better sense of the material components and the designs?
So I'd like to mention that Cameron and another teammate of ours gave an excellent talk at Android Developer Summit last year, and we're happy to provide the link for you in the show notes. So I think that's a really great place to get maybe a more extended look at how you might, there's several, I think, examples that were discussed. Mm-hmm. So you could see visually the power of material theming.
Yep, and we also have some code labs, which we can link to. We actually wrote them for I/O last year, but we're going through them and updating them and making sure they're still up to date and relevant. So, like by I/O this year, like if you take a look at those should be up to date and should give you a pretty good overview of like it's like how to build this sample app using material components.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. We'll add a link to the show notes for that.
Perfect. All right. Cameron, Connie, this has been a pleasure. Look out at I/O. You'll probably see me with my Holo themed app, and I'm going to ask you for some advice on getting that up to date with the material components. So
looking forward to it.
Be excited for that. If folks wanted to reach out to you before I/O, what's a good place to do that?
So we have, I guess, our GitHub is probably the best place to get kind of in contact with us somewhat. But we also have if you go to like our issues page on GitHub, that will link to our internal, like our Buganizer, which
Issue
is
tracker.
Issue tracker. Yeah. So, if you have bugs or anything like that, maybe that's a good place. Otherwise, like Stack Overflow is a good place to ask questions. We actually look and like make sure that questions there have like reasonable answers. What else?
We're also part of the Android study group. Thank you, actually, Kaushik, for enlightening us to this community.
Yeah, perfect. And yeah, I'll make sure like that folks are able to reach out, and we'll add a link to all of those in the show notes. Thank you all so much for coming to the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Donn, if folks want to reach out to you, what's a good place to do that?
Best place is either going to be on Twitter or Instagram, and the handle's the same on both places. That's at Donn Felker. And Kaushik, what if folks want to get a hold of you and follow your escapades?
Pretty much the same. I'm Kaushik Gopal on Twitter and on Instagram, so that's the best place to get a hold of me. Thank you all so much for listening. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Connie and Cameron. This has been a pleasure. Like I feel like, I'm definitely more emboldened now to check material design and add it to some of these new apps that I'm creating. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to thank Sentry for sponsoring today's show. Their tagline is, "Your code is broken, let's fix it together." They're a super cool crash reporting service that gives you all the helpful details that you need when detecting and fixing errors in your application. Don't wait for your users to report your errors and crashes. Use Sentry to catch them earlier. Check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Once again, because Sentry is a common word, I want to make sure you get it right. Sentry.io. My thanks to Sentry for sponsoring today's show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Donn Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.